Look closely at this image. It's a wall within one of Egypt's most magnificent tombs, covered in intricate hieroglyphs that tell the story of a powerful pharaoh's reign. But here, in the very center of the tableau, something is wrong. There's a deliberate emptiness, a space where a royal name and figure should be, carefully chiseled away. And over there, a sarcophagus beautifully carved, yet the inscriptions that would identify its occupant have been systematically obliterated. This isn't an accident of time. This is a purposeful act of destruction. Someone went to great lengths to erase this individual from existence. But who was she, and what was so threatening about her legacy that those who came after felt they had to scratch her name from the stone, trying to silence her story for all eternity? This is the beginning of one of ancient Egypt's most compelling and enduring mysteries, the story of a queen who ruled, who wielded immense power, and who was then violently scrubbed from the official record. For centuries, the narrative of ancient Egypt has been dominated by the names we all know: Ramesses, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra. Their stories are carved in stone, celebrated in museums, and immortalized in film. But history, as it turns out, is often written by the victors, and sometimes the most fascinating chapters are the ones that were almost successfully deleted. This is a detective story carved in stone and written in whispers, a puzzle spanning thousands of years. We are about to embark on a journey to resurrect a lost ruler, to follow the faint traces she left behind and piece together the life of a woman so significant that her very memory became a threat. We will walk through sun-baked temples, decipher cryptic texts, and analyze the very tools used to deface her monuments, all in pursuit of a single, haunting question. What secret was so dangerous that it demanded such a complete and vicious act of forgetting? This is more than just an archaeological cold case. It is a window into the brutal politics of a lost world, a testament to the fact that even in a civilization defined by its quest for immortality, the fear of a powerful woman's legacy could drive men to try and rewrite history itself. We are going to uncover the clues, examine the theories, and meet the modern-day detectives, the archaeologists and historians, who have dedicated their lives to solving this enigma. The evidence is fragmentary, the path is littered with dead ends and red herrings, but the emerging picture is more astonishing than any fiction. So join me as we pull back the veil on one of Egypt's greatest secrets and finally give a name and a story to the unknown queen. The breakthrough came not from a grand, headline-grabbing excavation, but from a meticulous, almost forensic re-examination of a tomb that had been known to archaeologists for decades. Designated as KV60, it sits in the legendary Valley of the Kings, a place usually reserved for pharaohs, which alone made its occupant a figure of immediate interest. When a team entered the chamber in the early 20th century, they were met with a scene of bewildering contrasts. The burial itself was undeniably royal. They found fragments of a magnificent sarcophagus carved from crystalline quartzite, a material so hard and difficult to work with that its use was reserved for the very apex of society. Gilded furniture, exquisite jewelry, and precious amulets all spoke of a person of immense wealth and power, someone who was clearly prepared for a spectacular afterlife. Yet, everywhere they looked, the very identity of this individual had been violently assaulted. The golden coffins, which should have been covered in the name and titles of the deceased, showed clear signs of systematic erasure. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on the tomb walls, which traditionally narrated the soul's journey and identified its owner, were methodically chiseled away. Most strikingly, the images of the tomb's occupant were hacked out. In some places, you can still see the outline of a royal figure, the curve of a crown, the shape of a scepter, but the face and the name are gone, leaving only a ghostly silhouette in the stone. This created an almost unnerving dissonance. Here was a burial fit for a king or a queen, accompanied by a furious, state-sanctioned effort to ensure that no one would ever know who was buried there. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. Someone, it seemed, was determined that this person would never live again. This was no random act of vandalism. The precision of the destruction pointed to an official order, a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, executed with chilling efficiency. The tomb presented archaeologists with their first major puzzle. Who was important enough to warrant such a lavish send-off, yet so dangerous that their very image had to be obliterated from history? To understand the sheer brutality of this act of erasure, we must first step into the worldview of the ancient Egyptians. For them, a name was not merely a label. It was an essential component of a person's very being, a magical anchor that tethered their soul to both the world of the living and the afterlife. To speak a person's name was to summon them, to acknowledge their existence, and to grant them a form of continuous life. This belief was amplified exponentially when that name was enclosed within a sacred cartouche, that distinctive oval loop you see encircling the names of kings and queens. The cartouche wasn't just decorative, it was a symbol of cosmic order, a protective ring that shielded the royal name from chaos and evil, declaring that this individual was a ruler of the two lands, a living God on earth. Their name, written and spoken, was a vital part of the universe's balance. Erasing a name, therefore, was not simple historical revisionism, it was a metaphysical assassination. It was an attempt to unmake a person at the most fundamental level. By systematically chiseling away a royal cartouche and hacking out their image from temple walls and tombs, the perpetrators were doing something far worse than executing the body. They were seeking to obliterate the soul for all eternity. In the Egyptian conception of the afterlife, the soul needed a physical anchor, a statue, a mummy, a written name, to receive offerings and to sustain itself in the field of reed. To destroy these anchors was to condemn the soul to a second, final, and truly terrifying death. A death of non-existence, of being utterly forgotten, cut off from the cosmic cycle forever. This practice, known to scholars as damnatio memoriae, or the condemnation of memory, was the ultimate punishment a society obsessed with eternity could bestow. It was reserved for traitors, usurpers, and those whose legacy was deemed so dangerous that it had to be surgically removed from the fabric of reality itself. So when we look at the defaced sarcophagus in KV60, we are not just looking at vandalism, we are witnessing a deliberate, state-sanctioned act of soul murder. The violence of the tool marks, the careful selection of only the name and the face, tells us that this was a personal, hate-filled campaign. It speaks to a profound fear of this individual's enduring influence. Someone, likely a successor or a rival faction, was not merely trying to hide her story from future historians. They were trying to ensure she would receive no offerings, hear no prayers, and hold no power in the world to come. They wanted her utterly and completely gone. This realization transforms our mystery from an archaeological curiosity into a profound human drama. It means the queen we are searching for was not just powerful in life. Her memory was so potent, so threatening to the new order, that it demanded this cosmic-level retaliation. The very ferocity of the erasure is, ironically, the loudest testament to her original significance. Examining the destruction left behind is like analyzing a crime scene. The way her identity was attacked tells a specific story, revealing not just the fact of the erasure, but the mindset of the perpetrators. The first and most obvious clue is the tool work. In her tomb and on statues, we see the clear, sharp marks of a metal chisel, likely bronze, used to gouge out her face and systematically chip away the hieroglyphs of her name from within their cartouches. This was not a haphazard act of rage. It was a meticulous, labor-intensive process. Someone had to stand there for hours, carefully positioning the chisel to remove the raised relief of her image without causing unnecessary damage to the surrounding figures. This precision is profoundly telling. It suggests the work was commissioned, an official act carried out by skilled artisans who were, ironically, using their craft not to create but to uncreate. The very fact that they were so careful not to harm the images of other gods or royals nearby indicates they were following explicit orders. This wasn't a mob, it was a calculated purge. But then we encounter an even more nuanced and perhaps more spiteful technique, the use of plaster. In several key locations, particularly on temple walls where her name and titles were inscribed, the erasers didn't just chisel. They first covered the original inscriptions with a layer of plaster, creating a smooth, blank canvas over the old reality. Then, on this new surface, they often carved the names and titles of a different, acceptable pharaoh. This method is a powerful metaphor for the rewriting of history. It wasn't enough to simply remove her, they had to physically cover her up and assert a new narrative in her place. The choice of plaster is also a crucial chronological clue. Stone is eternal, but plaster is a temporary fix. It cracks, it flakes, it falls away over time. The fact that they used it suggests either a need for speed, a rush to complete the damnatio memoriae before her supporters could react, or a certain confidence that their new version of history would hold, making the underlying truth irrelevant. In some spots, this plaster has indeed crumbled with age, and like a palimpsest, the original name of the queen has begun to re-emerge, a ghost from the past stubbornly refusing to stay buried. The specific focus of the destruction speaks volumes about what her power represented. The erasers overwhelmingly targeted two things, her face and her royal cartouche. The face was the seat of individual identity, the point of connection between the ruler and the people. By obliterating it, they were denying her a personal existence, turning her from a person into a non-entity. The cartouche, as we've discussed, was the source of her eternal, divine power. By hacking it out, they were attempting to sever her connection to the gods and the cosmos. What's fascinating is what was often left untouched. In many scenes, the figure of her husband, the pharaoh, remains perfectly intact, standing right next to the empty space where she once was. This selective vandalism points directly to a power struggle that was deeply personal. She was the target, not her family line or her husband's reign. The message was clear: she alone was the problem. Her legacy was so threatening that it had to be surgically excised from an otherwise acceptable historical record. This pattern of targeted damage strongly implies that the conflict occurred very close to home, likely involving her immediate successor or a rival faction in the royal court who saw her influence, even in death, as a direct challenge to their own authority. The violence of the chisel marks, therefore, is not just the violence of tools on stone. It is the preserved echo of a bitter, personal, and politically charged feud that rocked the very foundations of the Egyptian state. To solve a mystery spanning millennia, you first need to establish exactly when it happened. The clues left in the tomb and on the defaced monuments became our primary evidence for building a timeline, acting like forensic markers at a crime scene. The artistic style of the wall paintings in KV60 provided a huge initial clue. Egyptian art wasn't static, it evolved in very specific ways across different dynasties. The way figures were drawn, the proportions of the human body, the specific details of clothing and crowns. All of these elements have a kind of artistic fingerprint that experts can use to date a tomb with remarkable accuracy. In this case, the elegant, flowing lines and the particular style of the hieroglyphs pointed strongly to the period known as the 18th dynasty, a golden age of Egyptian power that included famous rulers like Hatshepsut, Amenhotep III, and the family of Tutankhamun. This was a time of immense wealth and artistic flourishing, which perfectly matched the opulence of the quartzite sarcophagus and the gilded furniture found within the burial chamber. Further corroboration came from the humble yet incredibly reliable evidence of pottery. While grand statues grab headlines for archaeologists, pottery is often a more precise dating tool. Styles of jars, bowls, and vessels changed frequently and are well documented across different reigns. The types of pottery fragments discovered in the tomb, from storage containers that once held food and wine for the afterlife, were unmistakably from the late 18th dynasty. This wasn't just a general time frame, it narrowed the window down to within a few decades, but the most critical piece of the puzzle came from the inscriptions that were left alone. Remember, the erasure was targeted. While the Queen's name and face were chiseled away, the names of other royal figures in associated temples and on nearby objects were often left completely intact. In several instances, the plaster that was used to cover her cartouches was then reinscribed with the name of a very specific and very powerful pharaoh, Thutmose III. This is where the timeline snaps into sharp, dramatic focus. Thutmose III was one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt for his brilliant military campaigns. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent, but his early reign is shrouded in a fascinating power struggle. For the first 2 decades of his rule, he was largely sidelined by a co-regent, a female pharaoh who ruled as the senior monarch. This was a woman who didn't just influence the throne, she occupied it wearing the full regalia of a king, including the false beard. For years after her death, Thutmose III ruled alone, and his name is the one we find stamped over hers. So, the forensic evidence creates a compelling chain. The artistic style and pottery place the Mystery Queen squarely in the late 18th dynasty. The fact that Thutmose III's name is systematically written over the erased spaces points directly to her as the target of his damnatio memoriae. We have the perpetrator, the method, and the motive all converging on a single, remarkable historical moment. The unknown queen was not a minor wife or a forgotten princess. She was a full pharaoh, a woman who once ruled Egypt and whose legacy was so formidable that her own stepson and successor felt compelled to launch a campaign of total erasure against her. The ghost in the tomb was finally gaining a historical context, and her story was about to become even more incredible. The deliberate erasure we see in tombs is only one part of the story. The campaign against her memory extended out into the open air to the colossal statues that once lined temple avenues and proclaimed her power to the people. Here, the ancient revisers of history employed a different, and in some ways even more revealing, tactic: repurposing. Rather than simply destroying these expensive and time-consuming monuments, they often found it more efficient to literally reshape her identity, turning a queen's statue into a king's. This practice of usurpation provides some of the most visually obvious and damning clues in our entire investigation. Across Egypt, at sites like Karnak Temple, archaeologists began to notice statues that just didn't look quite right. They would be formally perfect, depicting a pharaoh in the classic striding pose, wearing the traditional Nemes headcloth and false beard. But on closer inspection, the proportions often seemed subtly off. The shoulders might be unusually narrow for a male ruler, the hips a bit wider, or the facial features, despite being recarved, retained a softer, more feminine quality beneath the stern royal expression. The most telling evidence, however, lies in the stone itself. Sculptors would methodically grind down the original inscriptions on the statue's belt, shoulders, and base. Then they would meticulously recarve the cartouches and titles of a male pharaoh, most commonly Thutmose III, directly over the smoothed-out surface. But stone has a memory. In many cases, the new carving is slightly shallower than the original. Over millennia, the slow, gentle abrasion of wind-blown sand acts like a form of archaeological development, slowly eroding the surface and revealing the ghost of the older, deeper inscription hiding beneath the new one. Using careful lighting and silicone casts, epigraphers can sometimes recover the original name that was so carefully removed, and time and again, the same royal name emerges from the stone. This process of palimpsest, of one text written over another, gives us a direct physical record of the change. We are not just inferring that a statue was usurped, we can literally see the original queen's name peeking out from under the king's, a silent protest in stone. This wasn't a haphazard cover-up, it followed a clear and logical, if cynical, protocol. Creating a massive granite or diorite statue was an enormous undertaking, requiring quarries to be opened, teams of laborers to transport the stone, and master sculptors to spend years on the work. It was far more practical and cost-effective to simply reassign this existing symbol of power to the new regime. By taking a statue of the female pharaoh and re-inscribing it for Thutmose III, the officials were accomplishing two goals simultaneously. First, they were physically removing her from the public eye, deleting her visible presence from the ritual landscape. Second, and perhaps more brilliantly from a propaganda standpoint, they were appropriating her legacy. They were taking the very monuments she had built to celebrate her own reign and using them to magnify the glory of her successor. It was a powerful statement. Not only was she gone, but her achievements and her resources were now his. Her divine authority was being physically absorbed and redirected to support his rule. The specific modifications made to these statues speak volumes about the nature of her original representation. In several instances, the sculptors had to alter the very body of the statue. Some female pharaohs, in their official portraiture, chose to be depicted in a hybrid style that combined traditional male regalia, like the kilt and the Nemes headdress, with subtle feminine physical traits. When these statues were converted for a male king, the stone around the chest was often chiseled flat to remove any suggestion of breasts, and the facial structure was hardened, with a stronger jawline and more prominent brow carved into the existing stone. On one particularly telling colossal statue, the queen was originally shown with her arms crossed over her chest in the Assyrian pose of a ruler after death, a symbol of resurrection and divine kingship. The usurpers not only recarved the face and inscriptions, but went so far as to physically break off the arms and re-sculpt them into a different, less symbolically charged position, as if to strip her of even her posthumous royal status. This level of detailed physical alteration shows a deep understanding of the symbolic power embedded in these statues. It wasn't enough to change the name. They felt compelled to change the very gender and posture of the figure, attempting to rewrite the body of the queen into the body of a king. The sheer effort involved in this campaign of transformation proves one thing beyond any doubt. The memory of this woman was not just an inconvenience to be hidden, but a competing source of political and religious authority that had to be systematically dismantled and absorbed. To truly appreciate the scale of this historical cover-up, we need to put a name to the ghost, and the first compelling candidate draws us directly into one of the most turbulent and bizarre chapters in all of Egyptian history, the Amarna period. Imagine a ruler abruptly abandoning a religion that had structured society for over 1,000 years. This is precisely what Pharaoh Akhenaten did, forcing the entire country to worship a single, abstract sun god, the Aten, and moving the capital to a brand new city built in the desert called Amarna. This radical religious revolution turned the powerful priesthood of the traditional god Ammon into instant enemies and destabilized the entire empire. When we search for a queen powerful enough to warrant total erasure, one figure from this era stands out with an almost magnetic pull: Nefertiti. Her famous bust portrays a woman of stunning beauty and undeniable authority, but her role was far greater than just a royal consort. Inscriptions and reliefs from Amarna show her participating in rituals traditionally reserved for the pharaoh alone, even smiting Egypt's enemies in a manner only kings were depicted doing. She wasn't just by Akhenaten's side, she was his partner in power, a co-regent in all but name, and possibly even a pharaoh in her own right under the name Neferueten. So what could have made her memory so dangerous that it needed to be scrubbed away? The motive lies in the aftermath of the Amarna experiment. After Akhenaten's death, his new religion collapsed. The capital was abandoned, and the traditional priesthood of Ammon, whose wealth and power had been stripped away, stormed back into control with a vengeance. The new regime, led by the boy King Tutankhamun and his advisors, undertook a massive project of counter-revolution. Their mission was to restore the old gods, appease the furious priests, and erase the Amarna heresy from history. In this context, Nefertiti was a potent symbol of the fallen regime. As Akhenaten's chief enforcer and the possible female pharaoh who briefly succeeded him, her name and image were inextricably linked to the upheaval and sacrilege. For the restorers of the old order, allowing her monuments to stand would have been like leaving a monument to a traitor in the town square. Her continued presence in stone would have been a constant, dangerous reminder of the alternative path Egypt had taken, a path that nearly destroyed the state religion. Erasing her was not just an act of personal spite, it was a necessary step in the national healing, a way to symbolically purge the land of its recent, chaotic past and reaffirm the supremacy of Ammon. But here is where the historical detective work becomes incredibly complex. While Nefertiti is a prime suspect, the evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Her iconic bust was found in Amarna, but it was left unfinished in a sculptor's workshop, not violently defaced in a temple. More critically, while her name and images certainly became less prominent after Amarna, there isn't the same widespread, systematic, and ferocious campaign of damnatio memoriae targeted specifically at her that we see with our unknown queen from KV60. The erasure of the Amarna rulers was more of a blanket condemnation. Akhenaten was the main target, referred to in later king lists as that criminal of Akhenaten. The destruction was broader, aimed at the entire period and its primary instigator. The case of Nefertiti teaches us a crucial lesson in our investigation. A powerful queen from a controversial time is a logical candidate, but the specific pattern of destruction we are tracing personal, precise, and overwhelmingly focused on a single female ruler points to a conflict that was even more direct and personal than the general backlash against a failed religious revolution. This forces us to turn our attention to another, even more formidable woman, whose story of power and erasure is written even larger across the monuments of Egypt. If the destruction was part of a broad backlash against the Amarna heresy, then we must step into the political and religious storm that defined the era. The traditional Egyptian worldview was a delicate balance, a concept known as Mat, representing order, truth, and harmony. This cosmic balance was maintained by the pharaoh through his partnership with the powerful priesthood of the god Ammon. The vast temple estates of Ammon were not just religious centers, they were the economic engine of the state, controlling land, resources, and labor across Egypt. The entire society was built upon this symbiotic relationship between the palace and the temple. Then came Akhenaten, his radical decision to abandon the entire pantheon of gods in favor of a single, exclusive deity, the Aten or the sun disk, wasn't just a theological shift. It was a political and economic revolution that aimed a wrecking ball directly at the foundation of the Egyptian state. By closing the temples of Ammon, seizing their assets, and diverting all worship and wealth to his new sun cult, Akhenaten didn't just change the state religion, he declared war on the most powerful institution in the country. He moved the capital to a virgin site in the desert, a place we now call Amarna, and built a glittering new city from scratch, a physical manifestation of his break with the past. For a brief, unsettling 2 decades, this new order held, but when Akhenaten died, the entire experiment collapsed under its own weight. The old priesthood had been humiliated and impoverished, the empire's foreign territories were neglected, and the people were likely bewildered by the abandonment of the gods who had protected them for centuries. The backlash was inevitable, and it was led by the very figures who would restore Mat. First came the boy King Tutankhamun, who was likely Akhenaten's son. Early in his reign, still under the name Tutankhaten, he was a product of the Amarna court, but he and his advisors quickly realized the empire was crumbling. A famous stone slab known as the Restoration Stela records his dramatic about-face. It describes a country where the temples had fallen into ruins, the gods had turned their backs on Egypt, and chaos reigned. Tutankhamun's decree was a total repudiation of Akhenaten's policies. He reopened the temples, restored the priesthood, and poured vast sums back into the cult of Amun. He even moved the capital back to the traditional administrative centers, effectively abandoning the city of Amarna to the desert sands. This was the first phase of the counter-revolution, an attempt to reset the clock and undo the damage. But the most thorough and vengeful erasure came under the next ruler, a former military general named Horemheb. He was not of royal blood, and his claim to the throne rested entirely on his ability to present himself as the nation's savior. For Horemheb, a simple restoration wasn't enough. To legitimize his own rule and ensure the Amarna heresy could never rise again, he needed to annihilate it from history itself. He launched an official, state-sponsored campaign of destruction that was breathtaking in its scope. His workers systematically dismantled the temples of the Aten at Amarna, using the stone blocks as filler for new constructions dedicated to Amun. At Karnak, for example, you can find Talatat blocks, the small, standardized stones Akhenaten used for rapid building, that were ripped from the Aten temples and used as the core for new pylons. Horemheb then covered them over with his own inscriptions, literally burying Akhenaten's legacy inside the walls of the very god he had tried to suppress. This was more than reuse, it was a symbolic entombment. Furthermore, Horemheb methodically had Akhenaten's name chiseled out of king lists, effectively writing him out of the official lineage of pharaohs. He backdated his own reign to follow directly after Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, pretending the entire Amarna interlude had never happened. In this sweeping narrative of damnatio memoriae, anyone closely associated with the fallen regime, especially a powerful queen who may have ruled in the turbulent period right after Akhenaten's death, would have been a prime target. Their monuments would not just be defaced, they would be recycled, buried, and forgotten as part of the national cleansing. This context makes the mystery of the unknown queen even more poignant. If she was, as some suspect, a figure like Nefertiti or her likely daughter, Meritaten, who stepped into a position of singular power during the collapse, then her erasure was a necessary casualty of this larger project. She wasn't just a rival to a single king like Thutmose III. She was a living symbol of a failed, sacrilegious state. Allowing her statues to stand or her name to be spoken would have been an ongoing insult to the restored god Amun and a dangerous reminder of a path that nearly tore the kingdom apart. The ferocity of the chisel marks on her monuments, then, is not just personal animosity, but the cold, efficient violence of a state reasserting its ideological purity. The empty spaces where her face used to be are the direct result of a calculated decision to purge the historical record of a traumatic and embarrassing chapter. Yet, the very fact that this campaign was so comprehensive, stretching from the royal tombs in Thebes to the dismantled temples of Amarna, confirms one thing: her power and influence were so significant that they were perceived as a threat even decades later, a ghost that had to be exorcised with hammers and chisels to ensure the new old order could finally stand secure. While the Amarna theory provides a compelling narrative of religious backlash, there is another, even more direct precedent for a female pharaoh facing systematic erasure, one that takes us back a century earlier to a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. To understand this candidate, we must journey to the very heart of the great temple complex at Deir el-Bahari, a monumental structure of colonnaded terraces carved into the face of a sheer limestone cliff. This is not just a temple, it is a bold and audacious piece of political propaganda in stone, built by and for a woman who declared herself king, Pharaoh Hatshepsut. As the daughter of the powerful Thutmose I, Hatshepsut began her career as the great royal wife to her half-brother, Thutmose II. When he died unexpectedly, his heir, Thutmose III, was just an infant. Stepping into the power vacuum, Hatshepsut did not merely act as regent, a temporary placeholder for the boy king. She took the revolutionary step of crowning herself pharaoh, ruling as the senior co-regent for over 2 decades. Her reign was a golden age of architectural achievement and peaceful trade. She launched a legendary trading expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back myrrh trees, gold, ivory, and exotic animals, an event she had lavishly depicted on her temple walls. She erected towering obelisks at Karnak, their tips once sheathed in electrum to gleam in the sun. To legitimize her unprecedented rule, Hatshepsut masterfully crafted a divine origin story. Reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show the god Ammon himself visiting her mother, declaring that he is the true father of the future ruler. In her official statuary, she presented herself in the full regalia of a male king. The Neme's headcloth, the false beard, the muscular torso of a man, while often allowing her name to retain its feminine grammatical form, a fascinating duality of identity. She was a ruler who successfully navigated the profound contradiction of being a woman in a man's office, building a legacy that was both peaceful and profoundly powerful. And for this, after her death, she was nearly wiped from existence. The campaign against Hatshepsut's memory provides the most chilling and direct parallel to the mystery of our unknown queen. It was her co-regent and stepson, Thutmose III, who, after decades of sharing power with her, unleashed a ferocious damnatio memoriae in the later years of his sole reign. The evidence of this destruction is everywhere. At Deir el-Bahari, her elegant, serene-faced statues were torn down and smashed, their fragments thrown into a nearby quarry. Her cartouches and images on temple walls were meticulously chiseled away. In some places, her figure was simply hacked out, leaving a haunting, woman-shaped void in the middle of a religious scene. In other instances, the stone was carefully smoothed over and the image of Thutmose III was carved in her place. The violence of this act, occurring 20 years after her death, speaks to a deep-seated, simmering resentment. Why would a successful and powerful king like Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, feel so threatened by the memory of a woman long dead? The motive appears to be rooted in the fundamental ideology of kingship itself. The pharaoh was not just a political leader, he was the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, a role intrinsically tied to male potency and the maintenance of cosmic order or mat. A female pharaoh, no matter how successful, was a cosmological anomaly. By erasing Hatshepsut from the record, Thutmose III was likely attempting to reassert a rigid, patriarchal model of kingship and secure the unbroken male lineage for his own son, Amenhotep II. He wasn't just trying to claim credit for her peaceful reign, he was trying to fix a perceived crack in the universe. He sought to retroactively make his own reign the sole, direct, and male succession from his father, Thutmose II, airbrushing the 2-decade rule of his powerful stepmother out of the picture. The sheer scale and precision of the attack on her monuments, far more systematic than what we see with the Amarna pharaohs, reveals a deep, personal, and ideological vendetta. It sets a powerful precedent. A female king was acceptable in life, as long as her legacy was dismantled in death to preserve the traditional narrative of power. This pattern makes Hatshepsut the archetype for the kind of queen our mystery tomb might contain, a woman who didn't just influence the throne, but who sat upon it, and whose very success became her posthumous crime. The systematic destruction aimed at Hatshepsut provides us with an almost perfect blueprint for understanding the campaign waged against our unknown queen. The parallels are startlingly precise, pointing to a familiar pattern of royal retribution that unfolded long after the ruler's death. For Hatshepsut, the erasure began not immediately, but roughly 2 decades into the sole reign of Thutmose III. This delay is critically important. It suggests the damnatio memoriae was not a heat-of-the-moment act of vengeance, but a calculated decision made by a secure and powerful king who no longer needed to appease any remaining loyalists from his stepmother's court. He was methodically rewriting the official history to solidify his own dynasty's legacy. The teams he sent into her temples, like her magnificent mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri, were instructed to be surgical. They didn't topple every wall, they specifically targeted her image and her royal cartouche. In countless reliefs, you can see the outline of a female pharaoh in the full regalia of kingship, but her face and her names are gouged out, leaving a ghostly, woman-shaped silhouette in the stone, while the figures of gods and other royals around her remain completely untouched. This is the exact same selective vandalism we find in KV60 and on the statues linked to our mystery queen. The tools and techniques themselves are identical, serving as a kind of archaeological fingerprint. In both cases, we see the clear, sharp marks of bronze chisels used by skilled craftsmen. These workers knew exactly how to remove raised relief without unnecessarily damaging the valuable stone beneath. They carefully positioned their tools to pop out the hieroglyphs of the name and the facial features, a labor-intensive process that required patience and intent. This was not the work of a rampaging mob, it was a state-sanctioned professional operation. Furthermore, we see the same clever, cynical use of plaster as a cover-up medium. At Karnak Temple, sections of Hatshepsut's obelisks were encased in stone walls, but in other locations, plaster was used to smooth over her inscriptions before new text was carved. This method of physically burying the old reality under a new one is a direct match for the evidence we have of the unknown queen's erased monuments. The perpetrators in both campaigns were not just destroying, they were actively reassigning history, attempting to take the monumental achievements of a powerful woman and absorb them into the legacy of a male successor. But perhaps the most telling parallel lies in the underlying motive. Thutmose III's campaign against Hatshepsut was not about petty revenge for his long period of co-regency. It was a profound ideological correction. The Egyptian concept of kingship was fundamentally masculine. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus. A successful female king like Hatshepsut, who ruled peacefully and built prolifically for over 20 years, was a dangerous anomaly. Her very existence challenged the core mythology of the state. By erasing her, Thutmose III was attempting to restore a rigid patriarchal line of succession and ensure a clean male-to-male lineage for his son, Amenhotep II. He was airbrushing a powerful, complicating figure out of the official story to make history neat, orderly, and ideologically pure. This provides a powerful lens through which to view our unknown queen. The fury of the chisel marks in her tomb suggests she, too, was not just a consort or an advisor. She was a ruler who fundamentally disrupted the traditional power structure. Her crime was likely not failure, but success. Her reign was so effective and her authority so unquestioned that her very memory posed a threat to the legitimacy of the man who came after her. The blueprint of Hatshepsut's erasure tells us that the occupant of KV60 was almost certainly a female pharaoh, and her story was so formidable that it had to be chiseled into oblivion. While the grand statues and temple walls were being systematically attacked, the objects buried with her in the silent darkness of KV60 tell a different, more intimate story. These were the possessions meant to accompany her into eternity, sealed away from the political turmoil above, and they provide an incredibly rich and untouched archive of her true status and the era in which she lived. The craftsmanship of the artifacts is nothing short of breathtaking, speaking to a workshop operating at the absolute peak of its skill. The gilded furniture fragments, for instance, show a technique known as gesso, a plaster-like base covered in delicate gold leaf. The patterns etched into this gold aren't just random decorations. They feature intricate scenes of papyrus and lotus plants, symbols of a unified Egypt, intertwined with protective deities like the goddess Hathor. This specific style of inlay and the particular way the gold was worked, with such fine, almost microscopic detailing, is a signature of artisans who worked during the reigns of Thutmose III and his immediate predecessors. Her jewelry offers an even more precise fingerprint. Among the finds were pieces inlaid with lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone that the Egyptians had to import all the way from Afghanistan. This alone signifies immense wealth and far-reaching trade connections, but it's the specific way the gold settings were constructed that gives us a crucial clue. The bezels, the frames that hold the stones, were made using a technique called granulation, where tiny spheres of gold are soldered onto the surface to create a textured, shimmering effect. This wasn't a common practice throughout all of Egyptian history. It was a hallmark of the royal workshops in the mid-18th dynasty. Furthermore, the iconography on a stunning gold pectoral, a broad chest ornament, depicted a vulture with its wings outstretched in a protective gesture. The vulture was a symbol of the goddess Nekhbit, the protector of Upper Egypt, but the specific way the feathers are rendered, with each one individually delineated in a radiating pattern, is a stylistic quirk that art historians have directly linked to the period of Hatshepsut's reign. It's as if the jewelers left their own secret signature, a code in gold and gemstones that points directly to a specific time and patron. Perhaps the most telling artifacts of all were her canopic jars. These were the containers used to hold the internal organs of the deceased after mummification, and for a royal burial, they were objects of the highest sanctity and expense. The set found in KV60 was carved from a beautiful, translucent alabaster, a material reserved for the most elite burials. The stoppers of these jars were crafted in the form of human heads, a style that was common before the later shift to stoppers shaped like the four sons of Horus. But it's the faces on these stoppers that are so revealing. They are not generic, idealized portraits. They possess a distinct, sharp-featured elegance with a pronounced arch to the eyebrows and a subtle, almost serene smile. This particular artistic style, this court face, is incredibly well documented. We see these exact same facial features, this same elegant bone structure, on statues and reliefs that are definitively identified as Hatshepsut. The workshop that carved the queen's official likeness also, it seems, carved the faces that would guard her organs for eternity. When you place a stopper from KV60 next to a known sculpture of Hatshepsut, the resemblance in stylistic execution is uncanny. It's the work of the same hands, the same school of artists operating under the same royal commission. This isn't just a similarity, it's a material link tying the unknown queen directly into the artistic and royal world of one of Egypt's most powerful female pharaohs. The very jars meant to preserve her physical essence in the afterlife now serve to preserve her historical identity, silently testifying to her true stature long after her name was scraped from the walls. But all these clues from the tomb and the temples lead to one final, crucial source of evidence, the queen herself. The silent testimony of the mummy, if we can find it, holds the potential to confirm everything we have pieced together from the stones and artifacts. The story takes a dramatic turn in the late 19th century, when archaeologists made a discovery that at first seemed to add another layer of confusion, but would ultimately provide a key to the entire mystery. In a small, nondescript tomb now known as KV21, they found two female mummies simply lying on the floor. They were badly damaged by flooding over the centuries, but their arms were positioned in a specific royal way, crossed over the chest, the right hand clasping a royal scepter. This was the pose of a queen or a pharaoh. For decades, these mummies were anonymous, labeled only as Mummy A and Mummy B, their identities lost to time. But one of them, through a chain of incredible scientific detective work, would become a leading candidate for our unknown queen. The investigation into her physical remains is a story of modern technology meeting ancient bone. The first breakthrough came with CT scanning, which allows us to look inside the mummy without causing any damage. The scans revealed a wealth of information. The woman was in her mid-30s to early 40s at the time of her death. There were no obvious signs of violent trauma, no unhealed wounds to the skull or bones that would point to assassination or battle. However, the scans did reveal subtle clues about her life. There was significant wear and tear on her spine, a common ailment among ancient Egyptians, but also signs of arthritis, suggesting a life that, while privileged, still involved the physical stresses of her time. More intriguingly, there was evidence of a dental abscess, a painful infection that could have led to blood poisoning. In an era without antibiotics, such an infection could easily have been the cause of her death, a quiet, biological end rather than a dramatic political murder. But the most powerful tool in our modern arsenal is DNA analysis. Extracting usable genetic material from mummies that are over 3,000 years old is incredibly difficult. Humidity, heat, and contamination over the centuries degrade the DNA. However, scientists were able to obtain samples from the mummy in KV-21 and compare them to the well-established royal mummies from the same dynasty, like Amenhotep II and Thutmose III. The results were startling. The DNA showed a close familial relationship, placing this woman squarely within the royal family of the 18th dynasty. She was not a minor wife from a foreign land. She was a direct descendant of the pharaohs. This genetic link was the final, critical piece of the puzzle that connected the anonymous mummy to the royal tomb and the defaced monuments. Yet the story of her body is as complex as the story of her statues. There is compelling evidence that her mummy was not originally buried in the simple KV-21. Many Egyptologists believe she was first interred in the magnificent but violently erased KV-60 with its quartzite sarcophagus. They theorize that during the political and religious turmoil that followed her death, perhaps during the later campaign to erase her memory, priests loyal to her lineage or simply trying to protect royal remains from tomb robbers secretly moved her body. They would have rewrapped her and hidden her in the unassuming KV-21 to keep her safe, a final, desperate act of preservation against the forces that sought to destroy her completely. This would explain the royal pose of the mummy in a tomb that otherwise lacks grand decoration. It was a clandestine royal burial, a secret held for millennia by the silent priests of the necropolis. So, what is the ultimate conclusion written in her bones and her genes? The scientific evidence tells a story of a woman of royal blood who died in the prime of her life from natural causes. She was important enough to be given a hidden but still respectful secondary burial by those who remembered her. She was genetically tied to the very pharaoh, Thutmose III, who later tried to erase her. When you combine this physical evidence with the artistic fingerprints from her funerary goods and the specific pattern of destruction on her monuments, a single, powerful identity emerges as the most compelling candidate. The woman in the tomb, the queen whose face was chiseled away, was almost certainly Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh. The arthritis in her joints speaks to a long life of rule. The royal DNA confirms her place in the dynasty, and the violent erasure matches the historical record of her stepson's campaign. Her mummy, once a nameless body on a tomb floor, has now become the final, silent witness, confirming that even the most thorough attempt to destroy a memory cannot entirely extinguish the truth. The stones were lied to, but her bones do not lie. But what if the reason for her erasure was not just political or ideological, but deeply personal and scandalous? Another compelling theory suggests that our unknown queen didn't just challenge the system. She may have committed a transgression so severe, so offensive to the core values of the monarchy, that her destruction was seen as a moral and ritual necessity. This is the scandal theory, a narrative that moves beyond power struggles and into the shadowy realm of palace intrigue, forbidden affairs, and even murder. Imagine a scenario where the queen, perhaps a powerful great royal wife, was implicated in a plot to assassinate the pharaoh himself, or consider the possibility of a clandestine affair with a court official, a violation of the divine purity of the royal bloodline. In a society where the pharaoh was a god on earth, such acts were not merely crimes, they were sacrilege, a direct assault on Maat, the cosmic order that held the universe together. The punishment for destabilizing Mat had to be absolute. A quiet execution wouldn't suffice. Her very spirit had to be banished from eternity to prevent her chaos from leaking into the afterlife and poisoning the kingdom forever. We find historical precedents for this kind of visceral reaction to royal disgrace, though they are often shrouded in just as much mystery. Consider the enigmatic case of a queen from a slightly later period named Tiye. She was the powerful wife of Amenhotep III and mother of the heretic king Akhenaten. While she wasn't erased herself, her name was associated with a figure who was. Her steward, a man named Ai, who later became pharaoh, was potentially involved in the turbulent succession after Tutankhamun's death. While evidence is circumstantial, it shows how high-ranking individuals could be implicated in power grabs that led to damnatio memoriae for others. A more direct and chilling example comes from the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. Papyrus court documents record a plot by a secondary queen, Tiye, to murder the pharaoh and place her son, Pentaweret, on the throne. The plot was discovered and the conspirators were put on trial. While the pharaoh may have died from his injuries, the retribution was swift and brutal. The conspirators were forced to take their own lives, and crucially, the Prince Pentaweret was also compelled to commit suicide. While his body was still buried, it was done without the proper rituals, a symbolic erasure meant to condemn his soul. This shows a clear blueprint. A direct attack on the pharaoh's life was met with an attempt to spiritually annihilate the perpetrator. Applying this framework to our unknown queen opens up a dramatic line of inquiry. What if she was the mastermind behind such a conspiracy? Or what if her crime was one of passion or perceived betrayal? An illicit relationship would have been a profound threat. The royal children were the literal continuation of the god Horus on earth. Introducing any doubt about their paternity or sullying the divine marriage risked shattering the entire theological foundation of the state. If she were found guilty of adultery, her erasure would have been a way to purify the lineage, to surgically remove the contamination she represented. The violence of the chisel marks, particularly those targeting her face, takes on a new, more intimate meaning in this light. It's not just about deleting a ruler, it's about expressing a very personal fury, a desire to punish her individually for a personal betrayal that endangered everything. The careful preservation of her husband's image right next to her obliterated form could be read not just as political strategy, but as a stark visual contrast. The righteous, preserved king standing eternally beside the hollow, disgraced shell of his treacherous queen. Of course, we must be cautious. The scandal theory is often the most seductive because it appeals to our love for dramatic, human stories of passion and betrayal. It's far easier to imagine a juicy palace intrigue than the complex, dry mechanics of a political succession struggle. The evidence for such scandals is almost always circumstantial, as the victors who wrote the history, or in this case, unwrote it, would have been careful to destroy the proof of the scandal itself along with the queen's identity. There would be no papyrus record left to indict her. The empty cartouches are the only indictment we have. This theory's greatest weakness is also its greatest strength. It explains the ferocity of the erasure. A political rival might be content to simply reclaim her monuments, but a pharaoh or a priesthood seeking vengeance for a deeply personal wound, a betrayal of trust, an attempt on their life, a stain on their divine honor, would be driven by a much darker, more visceral impulse. The act of chiseling wouldn't just be administrative, it would be cathartic. They weren't just rewriting history, they were enacting a ritual punishment, scouring her soul from the universe as punishment for a crime so heinous that its very memory threatened to defile the present. In the end, whether her transgression was treason, murder, or a broken vow, the silent, violent emptiness she left behind screams of a fall from grace so complete that only total obliteration could restore the cosmic balance she was accused of upsetting. There is another possibility, one that turns our gaze away from internal power struggles and out toward the wider world of international diplomacy and ancient superpower rivalries. What if the queen was not originally Egyptian at all? What if she was a foreign princess sent from a powerful empire like the Hittites or the Mitanni to seal a political alliance through marriage? This foreign bride hypothesis presents a compelling and tragic narrative where the queen's ultimate erasure was not about her gender or her personal actions, but about her origins. In this scenario, her crime was her bloodline, and her destruction was an act of nationalist purification. To understand this, we need to step into the strategic mind of an Egyptian pharaoh. The 18th dynasty was a period of explosive imperial expansion, but maintaining that empire required more than just military might. It demanded cunning diplomacy. The kingdoms of the Near East were locked in a complex, delicate dance of power. To the north, in what is now Turkey, lay the Hittite Empire, a formidable military power. To the northeast, in modern-day Syria, was the kingdom of Mitanni, a rival renowned for its charioteers. A direct war with either could be catastrophic. So, the pharaohs often chose a different weapon, the marriage alliance. By sending a letter and receiving a foreign princess as a bride, a pharaoh could secure his border, gain a powerful ally, and neutralize a threat without losing a single soldier. These princesses were living peace treaties, their presence in the royal harem a constant physical symbol of an international accord. For a time, such an arrangement would have been celebrated. The queen would have been welcomed with great ceremony, her foreign gods perhaps given a place in the court, and her children by the pharaoh would stand in the line of succession, their mixed heritage a guarantee of continued peace. But international politics are fickle and alliances can shatter overnight. Imagine a dramatic shift in the geopolitical landscape. A new, more aggressive pharaoh ascends the throne, one who sees the old alliances as a sign of weakness. Or perhaps the foreign power from which the queen originated suddenly becomes an enemy. The Hittites might march on an Egyptian vassal state, or the Mitanni king might break a treaty. In an instant, the diplomatic bride, once a symbol of peace, becomes a dangerous liability. She is now a living reminder of a failed policy, a potential fifth column within the very heart of the palace. Suspicion falls upon her. Could she be sending secrets back to her homeland? Are her children, who carry the blood of the enemy, a threat to the purity of the Egyptian royal line? In this atmosphere of fear and rising nationalism, her presence becomes intolerable. A faction within the court, perhaps led by powerful native-born priests and generals who always distrusted the foreign influence, would have argued for a drastic solution. To truly break with the past and unite the country against the new external threat, the royal family had to be cleansed. The foreign queen and her lineage had to be excised, not just from the present, but from history itself, to erase what would have been seen as a foreign stain on the sacred blood of the pharaohs. This theory finds powerful echoes in the historical record, particularly in the Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets detailing the diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian court and other great powers. In these letters, we see the delicate negotiations for foreign brides laid bare. One particularly revealing letter involves a frustrated Babylonian king complaining to an Egyptian pharaoh, likely Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III. The Babylonian king had sent his daughter to Egypt and was insulted that the Egyptian king did not send a princess in return, arguing, "Why would you not send me a wife? Are you not a king like me?" This exchange highlights the intense sensitivity and the high stakes of these marital arrangements. It shows that these women were not just passive tokens, they were central to the prestige and perceived power of their home nations. If an Egyptian pharaoh were to later turn against that nation, the presence of that king's daughter in his harem would be a profound embarrassment and a potential rallying point for her home country. Removing her from the official record would be a way to sever that symbolic tie and deny the enemy any claim or connection to the Egyptian throne. The methodology of the erasure in this scenario would be particularly telling. If the motivation was to purge a foreign lineage, we would expect the destruction to extend beyond just the queen herself. Her children, Especially any sons who might have been in the line of succession would also have been targeted. Their names and images would be chiseled out of monuments, their claims to the throne erased to ensure a purely Egyptian-blooded pharaoh could take power. This is a different pattern than the personal vendetta we might see against a rival like Hatshepsut. This is a systematic cleansing of an entire branch of the family tree. The fact that the queen in KV60 was buried with such opulence, yet so violently defaced, could fit this narrative. She may have been greatly honored in life for her diplomatic role, only to be violently repudiated in death when that diplomacy failed. The very objects that confirm her high status, the gold, the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, the intricate jewelry that reflects international tastes could, in a bitter twist, have become the evidence used against her, proof of her alien origins in a court that had now turned inwards and xenophobic. Her tomb becomes a paradox, a burial fit for a queen whose greatest contribution to Egypt, her foreignness, became her ultimate, unforgivable sin. The brutal efficiency of the damnatio memoriae we have traced points toward a conflict of the highest possible stakes, one that threatened the very survival of the dynasty itself. Another potent explanation for such a total erasure lies not in the queen's own rule, but in her role as a mother, specifically the mother of a rival claimant in a bitter succession war. In the high-stakes game of the Egyptian throne, a royal mother was far more than just a parent. She was the head of a political faction, the keeper of a bloodline, and the chief advocate for her son's destiny. Her influence could make or break a pharaoh, but if her son gambled for power and lost, her fate was often sealed alongside his, her legacy condemned for having nurtured a challenger to the rightful order. To understand the gravity of this scenario, we need to picture the royal court in the days and weeks following a pharaoh's death. Unlike in later European monarchies with strict primogeniture, the succession in ancient Egypt could be surprisingly fluid. While the eldest son of the great royal wife was the preferred heir, the pharaoh often had children with multiple secondary wives, all of whom could, under the right circumstances, press a claim. The death of a king created a dangerous power vacuum, a moment of intense vulnerability where alliances shifted like desert sand. In this volatile atmosphere, the most powerful royal women, the king's wives and mothers, became the central players in a deadly political drama. A queen mother who had enjoyed her husband's favor could use her wealth, her network of court officials, and the loyalty of military commanders to champion her son's cause. She was the campaign manager for a candidate to the throne of the gods, and her success or failure would determine the future of the entire kingdom. Now, imagine our unknown queen in this precise role. She was likely a secondary wife, a woman of immense intelligence and ambition who had risen to a position of great influence. When the old king died, she saw an opportunity to place her own son on the throne, perhaps believing him to be more capable than the designated heir, or perhaps driven by a desire to secure her own power for the rest of her life. She would have mobilized her faction, making promises to generals, bribing priests for favorable oracles, and orchestrating a propaganda campaign to present her son as the true, divinely chosen successor. For a time, it might have seemed like she would succeed. Her son may have even been proclaimed pharaoh in one part of the country, leading to a brief, bloody civil war as two halves of Egypt fought for two different kings. This was the ultimate violation of Maat, the cosmic order, a single land torn in two, brother against brother, with the gods themselves seemingly in conflict. But then her faction lost, the rival claimant, backed by a stronger coalition or simply better luck on the battlefield, emerged victorious. The punishment for rebellion against the divine king was absolute. The losing claimant, the queen's son, would have been executed, or more likely, forced to commit suicide to avoid the ritual pollution of spilling royal blood. His name would be stripped from the monuments, but the victors knew that the true source of the rebellion was not just the ambitious prince, it was the ambitious mother who had guided his hand. She was the architect of the chaos, Her very existence in the historical record would serve as a permanent reminder of this traumatic rift, a testament that the dynasty's claim to divine, unbroken succession was a fragile fiction. To fully legitimize the new pharaoh's rule, the root of the challenge had to be annihilated. This is where the damnatio memoriae becomes a surgical political tool. By systematically chiseling out the queen's name, her image, and her titles, the victorious faction was doing more than just punishing a traitor. They were actively dismantling the legitimacy of their defeated rival's claim. In the Egyptian worldview, a king derived his right to rule from his royal lineage. If you erase the mother, you effectively erase the son's royal identity. By removing her from temple walls and king lists, the new regime was retroactively declaring that her son was never a legitimate contender, that he was a usurper of low-born origin, his claim so baseless it didn't even warrant a place in history. The empty space where her cartouche once was becomes a powerful piece of propaganda, silently proclaiming that this branch of the family never had any right to power. The careful preservation of the victorious pharaoh's image, often standing right next to the hacked-out silhouette of the queen, creates a stark visual narrative. Here stands the righteous, legitimate king, forever contrasted with the void that represents treason and chaos. This theory powerfully explains the very specific nature of the destruction we find. The violence is focused almost exclusively on her. Her husband, the previous pharaoh, remains untouched because his legacy is needed to legitimize the victor, who likely claimed direct descent from him. The destruction is not a blanket condemnation of an entire period, like with the Amarna pharaohs, but a precise, targeted strike against a single individual and her bloodline. The ferocity of the chisel marks tells a story of very personal hatred, the kind reserved for someone who betrayed the family from within, who fractured the dynasty and plunged the nation into conflict. Her opulent burial in the Valley of the Kings, fit for a royal, suggests she was indeed a woman of the highest status, a king's wife. But the savage erasure of her identity within that tomb suggests that status was irrevocably forfeit the moment her son raised an army against his rival. In the end, her crime was not ruling as a woman, but in nurturing a king who never was, and for that her story was sentenced to the most absolute silence. Even when the chisel did its most thorough work, scraping a name into oblivion, it often left behind another kind of clue, one that could be just as revealing. The ancient Vandals were meticulous in their focus, zeroing in on the personal cartouche, the unique identifier of the individual. But surrounding that void, often untouched, are the formal titles and epithets that define the queen's official role. These titles were not mere decorations, they were a precise and powerful resume, a framework of authority that tells us exactly where she stood in the rigid hierarchy of the Egyptian state. By carefully analyzing these surviving labels, we can begin to reconstruct the skeleton of her power, even when her name has been stolen from us. Consider the title King's Great Wife. On the surface, it sounds simple, denoting the principal royal consort, but in practice, this was a position of immense political and religious weight. A king's great wife was not just the mother of the heir, she was the female counterpart to the pharaoh in the cosmic order. In temple rituals, she played the role of the goddess Hathor to his Horus, a divine pairing essential for maintaining the fertility of the land and the favor of the gods. She would have managed her own vast estates, commanded a personal staff, and wielded significant influence over court appointments. Finding this title next to an erased cartouche immediately tells us we are dealing with a woman at the very apex of power, the partner of the ruling king. But we can often go even further. These titles were frequently linked to the name of the pharaoh she served. An inscription might read King's Great Wife of His Majesty, followed by the pharaoh's own, still intact cartouche. In this way, the very title becomes a bridge, allowing us to identify her husband and anchor her firmly within a specific reign, turning a mystery into a specific moment in history. An even more potent title, one bursting with political and economic clout, is God's wife of Ammon. This was not merely a priestly role, it was one of the most powerful offices a woman could hold in all of Egypt, especially during the New Kingdom. The god's wife was the human consort of the state god Ammon, conducting daily rituals to appease him in his innermost sanctuary. This granted her unparalleled religious authority, but it also came with staggering material wealth. The Temple of Ammon was the largest landowner and economic engine in the country, and as God's wife, she controlled a significant portion of its resources. She had her own administrative bureaucracy, her own military contingent, and the power to make offerings in the name of the god that could shape foreign policy. A queen bearing this title was a political force in her own right, independent of her husband. Her influence could rival and sometimes even challenge that of the pharaoh himself. The presence of this title next to an erased name signals a woman who commanded both spiritual devotion and hard economic power, making her a formidable figure whose legacy any successor might find threatening. Then there is the title Mother of the King. In a dynasty obsessed with lineage and legitimacy, this was perhaps the most unassailable source of a queen's enduring influence. The mother of the reigning pharaoh held a uniquely privileged position. She was the literal source of his divine right to rule, the vessel of the royal bloodline. As the king's mother, she often served as a trusted advisor, a powerful regent if her son was young, and the matriarchal head of the entire royal family. Her counsel would have been sought on matters of state, and her public appearances alongside her son reinforced the stability and continuity of the dynasty. Finding this title associated with our unknown queen would create a fascinating and tragic dynamic. It would mean that the pharaoh who likely ordered her erasure was in fact her own son. This transforms the damnatio memoriae from a political act into a profoundly Oedipal drama. Why would a son seek to annihilate the memory of the woman who gave him his throne? The motive could be deeply personal. Perhaps she wielded too much power as Queen Mother, refusing to cede control, creating a rivalry that could only end with her obliteration. Or it could be ideological, an attempt by the son to completely overshadow his mother's influence and present himself as a self-made king, his authority deriving solely from his own connection to the gods. By cross-referencing these surviving titles with the artistic style of the monuments and the pottery found in her tomb, Egyptologists can perform a kind of historical triangulation. For instance, if the title God's wife of Ammon appears in a specific script style known only from the reign of Thutmose III, and the associated artifacts match that period, the circle of possibilities shrinks dramatically. The titles act as institutional anchors, holding the ghost of the queen in place within the bureaucratic machinery of the state, even when her personal identity has been violently pried loose. They reveal that her power was not informal or whispered in corridors. It was officially sanctioned, publicly celebrated, and carved in stone for all to see. The systematic attempt to erase her name while sometimes leaving these powerful titles intact is a paradox that speaks volumes. It suggests that the perpetrators could not or would not erase the office she held, perhaps because it was too integral to the functioning of the kingship itself. They were content to destroy the person, but the structure of power she embodied was so fundamental that it had to remain, a silent, accusing frame around the empty space where a queen once was. While the grand temples and royal tombs give us the official, sanitized version of history, the truth often leaks out in the most unexpected places. To find the human whispers behind the state-sponsored silence, we must travel away from the grand avenues of Thebes and into a small, walled village nestled in a lonely valley. This is Deir el-Medina, the home of the very men who carved the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not slaves, but a highly skilled, literate, and state-salaried workforce, the elite artisans and scribes of their day. And because they were literate, they wrote, They kept records of their work, their supplies, their legal disputes, and their daily lives on flakes of limestone and papyrus. These fragments, preserved by the dry desert air, offer us a priceless window into the world beyond palace propaganda, a world where royal scandals and political upheavals were not just chiseled into stone, but discussed over a loaf of bread. The papyri from Deir el-Medina are a chaotic and glorious mess of human experience. We have records of the world's first known labor strikes, when the workers downed their tools because their monthly rations of grain and fish were late. We have vivid court transcripts detailing neighborhood squabbles, a man accused of stealing a goat, a woman sued for slander. We even have personal letters full of family drama and financial worries. These documents prove that news from the royal court, however filtered, did trickle down to the common people. The workers knew which pharaoh they were building a tomb for, and they would have been acutely aware of any sudden, dramatic shifts in the political winds. A change in royal patronage, a purge of high officials, or the mysterious disappearance of a queen would have directly impacted their work, their pay, and their conversations. So, do these gossipy texts hold any clues about our erased queen? Scholars have spent decades sifting through this mountain of correspondence, looking for any oblique reference, any curious absence, or any strange shift in protocol that might correlate with a damnatio memoriae. One fascinating area of focus is the recording of religious festivals. The villagers of Deir el-Medina were devout, and their records frequently mention which royal figures were included in prayers and offerings at local shrines. The presence of a queen's name in these lists meant she was recognized and honored by the state. Her sudden and permanent disappearance from these liturgical records would be a powerful indicator that something had happened, that she had fallen from official favor. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of airbrushing a disgraced comrade out of a Politburo photograph. While no papyrus has yet been found that explicitly states, "The great queen has been condemned and her name is to be erased," there are intriguing hints. Some fragments allude to periods of turmoil or reassessment in the royal house, vague terms that often cloak deeper conflicts. More compelling are the records related to tomb construction itself. The workers' journals, known as diaries, meticulously log their progress on specific royal tombs. Imagine the scenario if a crew, having spent years decorating a burial chamber with the name and image of a specific queen, were suddenly ordered to stop all work. Then a new crew arrives with a different assignment, to systematically enter that same tomb and methodically chisel out every single one of those names and faces. For the original artisans, this would have been a shocking and bewildering order. The damnatio memoriae would not have been a silent, secret act. For the community of Deir el-Medina, it would have been a major, disruptive, and deeply unsettling event. The fact that we don't have a papyrus that says, "Today we began chiseling out the queen's face," is itself telling. Such a sensitive, state-ordained task would have been communicated with extreme discretion, and any written records of it might have been deliberately destroyed to maintain the illusion that she never existed. The most tantalizing potential clues come not from official work logs, but from the realm of personal correspondence and even tomb robbery trials. In the later New Kingdom, papyri from the village record the testimonies of thieves caught looting the very tombs their ancestors built. Under interrogation, these men named the specific royal mummies they plundered. The absence of a certain queen's name from these lists could be significant. If her tomb was so thoroughly hidden and her identity so successfully erased that even the tomb robbers of a later era didn't know of its location or its occupant, that is a testament to the effectiveness of the campaign against her. The silence in the workers' village, therefore, can be as eloquent as any proclamation. The lack of her name in their prayers, the gap in the liturgical calendar, and the strange, unrecorded pause in their work on her monuments all point toward a profound and deliberate act of forgetting that reached from the highest levels of the priesthood down to the daily routines of the tomb builders. The wind that howled through the valley of Deir el-Medina carried not just sand, but whispers of a secret so dangerous that even the most skilled scribes in Egypt dared not write it down. For years, the tomb designated as KV60 had been mapped, photographed, and studied down to the smallest visible detail, and the consensus was grim. The ancient Vandals had done their work with ruthless proficiency. Every royal cartouche on the sarcophagus, every image of the tomb's owner on the walls had been systematically obliterated. The case seemed to have reached a dead end, the queen's identity lost to the chisel. But the most compelling detective stories often turn on evidence that was there all along, hiding not in the shadows but in plain sight, waiting for a new way of seeing. The breakthrough came not from a new excavation, but from a re-examination of the tomb's greatest treasure using technology its original artisans could never have conceived. The team decided to perform a high-resolution CT scan of the massive quartzite sarcophagus lid. This wasn't just about looking for hidden chambers or analyzing the mummy. It was about reading the stone itself in a way the human eye cannot. As the scanner's invisible beams passed through the crystalline structure of the quartzite, compiling a three-dimensional digital model slice by infinitesimal slice, something extraordinary began to emerge on the computer screens. On the interior surface of the sarcophagus lid, the side that would have been facing downward, pressed against the mummy for millennia, the scan data revealed a series of faint, shallow grooves. To the naked eye, in the dim flicker of tomb torches, this surface would have appeared perfectly smooth and blank. The destroyers, in their focused rage, had concentrated their efforts on the highly visible exterior and the rim, never thinking to flip the multi-ton lid over to check its hidden underside. But the CT scan, with its ability to detect minute variations in depth and density, picked up the ghost of an inscription. It was a cartouche, and within it, the faint but unmistakable shapes of hieroglyphs. The team was looking at the Queen's true name, a secret whispered into the very stone that was meant to cradle her for eternity, a message meant for the gods alone, inadvertently shielded from the hands of men who sought to destroy it. The process of digitally clarifying this ghost inscription was a painstaking labor of love. Using a technique called reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, the team compiled a series of photographs of the sarcophagus interior taken from a fixed position, but with a light source held at a different angle for each shot. This process is like creating a perfect digital rubbing of a surface. The software then combines all these images, allowing an expert to virtually move the light source across the inscription in any direction, enhancing the contrast of the shallow grooves against the surrounding stone. With each virtual pass of the light, the hieroglyphs grew sharper and more defined. The signs emerged from the digital darkness: a seated goddess, a loaf of bread, a pair of arms raised in adoration. And then the full name resolved into clarity. It was a throne name, one of the 5 great names of an Egyptian monarch, a name that proclaimed her divine right to rule. This was not just a name, it was a title of power, and it matched inscriptions that had been found, similarly defaced, on statues and temple walls far from the valley. The secret was out. The destroyers had missed their target. The Queen had safeguarded her identity in the one place they never thought to look, and 3,000 years later, a silent, digital light had finally brought her back into the world. Imagine for a moment that we could give this ghost a blood test, that we could reach across 3,000 years and ask her bones to reveal the one thing her enemies tried so hard to conceal: her family. This is precisely the revolutionary power of paleogenetics, the science of extracting and analyzing ancient DNA. For decades, the mystery of the unknown queen was a puzzle solved with art, history, and archaeology. But now we have a tool that feels almost like a time machine. The process begins in a sterilized laboratory where a team of geneticists takes a tiny sample of bone, often from the femur or the petrous bone of the skull, which are the best protected areas for preserving genetic material. The challenge is immense. Over millennia, DNA degrades, shattering into tiny fragments and becoming contaminated by the DNA of everyone who has handled the mummy, from ancient priests to modern archaeologists. Isolating the authentic, ancient genetic code is like trying to reconstruct a shredded, ancient manuscript from a pile of modern confetti. But through painstaking, meticulous work, it is possible. Once a reliable DNA profile is secured, the real detective work begins, building a family tree. The strategy is to compare the unknown queen's genetic signature to those of the royal mummies we can identify with certainty, like Amenhotep II or Thutmose III. By looking for shared segments of DNA, scientists can map out their relationships with astonishing precision. The results can tell us several things. A direct match in the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively from mother to child, would reveal her maternal lineage, connecting her to a specific queenly line. Meanwhile, the nuclear DNA can reveal paternal relationships, showing if she was the daughter of a particular pharaoh. This genetic evidence can definitively answer the most fundamental questions about her. Was she a king's daughter, a princess born into the purple? Was she a king's wife, a woman who married into the dynasty? Or was she a king's mother, the matriarchal source of a pharaoh's legitimacy? Each of these positions carries a different kind of power and, consequently, a different kind of motive for her eventual erasure. Let's consider what each result would mean for our understanding of her story. If the DNA shows she was the daughter of a powerful pharaoh like Thutmose I, it would instantly explain her high status and her presence in the Valley of the Kings. Royal daughters were political assets, but they could also be threats, especially if they had strong claims to the throne that challenged a half-brother or a nephew. If the genetic evidence instead reveals she was the wife of a pharaoh, such as Amenhotep II, it places her at the very heart of the court, but also makes her vulnerable to the purges that often followed a king's death, when new rulers consolidated power by sidelining the previous king's favored wives. The most explosive possibility, however, is if the DNA proves she was the mother of a pharaoh. This would create a deeply personal and tragic dynamic. It would mean that the king who likely ordered her damnatio memoriae was her own son. The motive for such an unthinkable act could be a bitter power struggle where the Queen Mother refused to relinquish her influence, or perhaps a scandal where the son sought to completely overshadow her legacy to strengthen his own independent claim to divinity. The potential of this technology to rewrite history was spectacularly demonstrated by the famous study of the mummy known as the Younger Lady, found in KV 35. For years, this mummy was an anonymous figure, but DNA analysis revealed she was both the daughter of Amenhotep III and the mother of Tutankhamun, making her none other than the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten's sister and wife. This genetic evidence solved a century-old mystery and confirmed the intense inbreeding within the late 18th dynasty royal family. Applying this same rigorous methodology to our unknown queen could yield a similarly definitive identification. However, we must also acknowledge the limitations and controversies. Ancient DNA is incredibly fragile, and contamination is a constant concern. Furthermore, the absence of a clear genetic match doesn't necessarily mean she wasn't royal. She could have been a wife from outside the main bloodline, or the crucial mummy needed for comparison might be lost or yet undiscovered. DNA provides a biological fact, but it is up to historians and archaeologists to interpret what that fact meant in the brutal, ritualistic world of Egyptian power politics. It can tell us who she was related to, but we must still piece together why that relationship became so dangerous that it had to be chiseled into oblivion. So we have her name, her story, and the evidence of the brutal campaign waged against her memory. But what did she actually look like? For centuries, she was a ghost, a silhouette in stone. Now, modern science offers us an unprecedented opportunity to gaze into the face of this mysterious queen, to bridge a gap of 3,000 years and meet her quite literally eye to eye. This remarkable process is known as forensic facial reconstruction, and it is far more than just artistic guesswork. It is a meticulous scientific discipline that blends anatomy, anthropology, and cutting-edge technology to rebuild a person's likeness directly from their skeletal remains. If a potential mummy for our queen has been identified, the journey to reconstruct her face begins not with clay but with data. The first and most crucial step is a high-resolution CT scan of the skull. This scan creates a perfect digital 3D model, capturing every minute detail: the subtle ridge above an eye socket, the specific width of the nasal opening, the unique curve of the jawline. This digital skull becomes the unshakable foundation, the literal bone structure upon which everything else will be built. Using specialized software, a forensic anthropologist then begins the fascinating work of plotting out the musculature. This is where deep anatomical knowledge becomes paramount. The points where muscles attach to the skull leave tiny, identifiable marks called landmarks. By mapping these landmarks, experts can digitally reconstruct the major muscles of the face: the masseters that work the jaw, the temporalis muscles at the temples, and the complex web of muscles that control expression around the mouth and eyes. The thickness of this muscular layer isn't a random guess either. Decades of research into human populations have yielded detailed data on the average depth of facial tissue at key points across the skull. These measurements vary slightly based on the individual's ancestry, age, and even overall health and nutrition. Since our queen was a member of the elite, likely well-nourished, the tissue depth markers applied would reflect that robust physiology. Layer by digital layer, the software builds up a basic, anatomically correct form over the skull, creating a muscle and tissue mask that is scientifically informed and unique to this specific individual. Then comes the most subjective yet still guided phase of the process: sculpting the final features. This is where forensic art meets hard science. The shape of the skull dictates many of the most prominent features. The width of the nasal aperture, for instance, gives a very accurate range for the width of the nose. The projection of the jaw determines whether the face would have had a strong, prominent chin or a more receding one. The distance between the eyes, the height of the cheekbones, the slope of the forehead, all of these are direct consequences of the underlying bone structure. For elements where the skull offers less definitive guidance, like the exact shape of the lips or the tip of the nose, artists rely on statistical probabilities derived from the population the individual belonged to. They might also look for clues on the skull itself, where patterns on the teeth can hint at the set of the lips, and subtle asymmetries can suggest a lifetime of habitual expressions. To see the power of this process, we can look at other famous reconstructions, like that of the Neolithic man known as Cheddar Man from Britain. His reconstruction with dark skin and blue eyes completely upended public perception of what ancient Britons looked like. For an Egyptian queen, the artists would draw upon a wealth of artistic evidence from her time. While her own statues were defaced, countless other portraits from the same dynasty survive. These provide invaluable context for elements like hairstyles, which are not preserved on the skull. Would she have worn the intricate, heavy wigs shown in so many reliefs? Would her ears be pierced, as was common? Her eye shape and skin tone would be informed by the known physical characteristics of the ancient Egyptian population. The final result is a breathtaking fusion of cold, hard data and informed cultural interpretation. It is not a photograph, but it is a scientifically plausible portrait, a face that is entirely her own, rebuilt from the very framework she carried through life. When this process is complete, the anonymous mummy is no longer just a collection of bones. She becomes a person. You can see the determination in her jawline, the intelligence in the set of her eyes, the life experience etched into the proportions of her face. It transforms her from a historical abstraction into a human being who lived, breathed, and wielded immense power, making her epic story of rise and fall feel immediate, tangible, and profoundly real. Yet this story of erasure may not have the final word. While the chisel successfully scraped her name from the stone, the ghost of her political influence, the very blueprint of female power she established, may have seeped into the foundations of the monarchy, subtly shaping the ambitions and strategies of the powerful queens who came after her. Consider the later Ramesside period and its most celebrated queen, Nefertari, the beloved wife of Ramesses the Great. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most breathtakingly beautiful in all of Egypt, a testament to her husband's very public adoration. But look closer at her role beyond the stunning murals. Nefertari wasn't just a decorative consort, she was a key diplomat, corresponding with foreign leaders like the Hittite queen Pujuhepa, and she actively participated in the religious cults, holding titles that granted her significant economic and ritual authority. This model of a queen as an active political partner and a key player in international diplomacy feels less like a spontaneous innovation and more like the refined echo of a much older precedent. Could it be that the unknown queen's successful reign, even in its censored form, created a kind of subliminal memory, a proof of concept that a woman could operate at this level of statecraft without the kingdom collapsing? Her forced disappearance may have served as a cautionary tale about the danger of overt power, but her unseen legacy might have demonstrated its immense utility, encouraging later pharaohs to empower their own wives in more visible yet carefully managed ways. The chain of influence potentially extends even further, reaching all the way to the last and most famous pharaoh of them all, Cleopatra VII. While separated by over 1,000 years, Cleopatra's rule displays a fascinating resonance with the strategies we suspect were employed by our erased predecessor. Cleopatra was a master of political theater and divine association, famously presenting herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. This direct identification with a powerful deity to legitimize rule is a tactic we see in the statuary and temple reliefs of earlier female pharaohs. More importantly, Cleopatra, like the queen from KV 60, understood that her power could not rest on Egyptian tradition alone. She actively engaged with the dominant Mediterranean powers of her time, forming personal and political alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to secure her throne and Egypt's independence. This pragmatic, outward-looking strategy, leveraging foreign alliances to bolster domestic power, is precisely the kind of policy a queen ruling in a golden age of empire like the 18th dynasty would have championed. The unknown queen's story, even in its fragmented state, represents a foundational chapter in the long, complex history of female sovereignty. Cleopatra, a highly educated ruler who would have had access to ancient records and chronicles, may have been studying the long arc of Egyptian history. In the gaps of the official record, in the silent spaces where a queen's name should have been, she might have discerned the shadow of a predecessor who proved that a woman could rule, not just as a regent but as a full pharaoh, a lesson she took to its ultimate, dramatic conclusion. This enduring influence challenges the very purpose of the Damnatio Memoriae. The attempt to erase her was an attempt to kill the idea that a woman could hold ultimate, unmediated power and that her legacy could be as formidable as any king's. But ideas, especially successful ones, are remarkably difficult to murder. They don't reside only in inscriptions. They live in the structures of government, in the protocols of diplomacy, and in the subtle, unspoken expectations of what is possible. The later queens of Egypt, from the politically astute Nefertari to the brilliantly strategic Cleopatra, may have walked through the political space that the unknown queen first carved out, even if the walls surrounding that space were scrubbed clean of her name. Her true legacy, therefore, might not be in the monuments she left behind, but in the enduring precedent she set. The very fury of the attack against her memory is the clearest evidence we have of just how formidable that precedent was. It proved that a woman's rule could be so effective, so impactful, that it terrified the establishment into trying to rewrite reality itself. In failing to completely erase her, they inadvertently created a different kind of monument, not one of stone and gold, but one of lasting influence, a ghostly blueprint for female power that would subtly guide the hands of queens for centuries to come. The hunt for the unknown queen has moved from the sun-scorched valleys of Egypt to the quiet, dust-scented archives of universities and museums around the world. Today's Egyptologists are less like Indiana Jones and more like forensic cold case detectives, armed not with whips and pistols, but with digital scanners, spectral imaging cameras, and an unwavering patience for paperwork. The most dramatic breakthroughs are no longer happening just in the field. They are unfolding in library basements and on computer servers where forgotten clues have been sitting for a century, waiting for the right set of eyes to see them. This is the modern search, a meticulous process of reinterrogating the evidence with tools the original discoverers could never have imagined. A huge part of this work involves what scholars call archival archaeology, the painstaking process of scouring through the original excavation notes, personal diaries, and faded photographs from the early 20th century digs. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, the world watched in breathless anticipation, but dozens of other tombs were being cleared with far less fanfare. The archaeologists of that era, working under immense pressure and with limited resources, often made quick decisions about what was important. A fragment of a beautifully carved stone vessel might be noted in a dig diary as alabaster fragment, uninscribed, and then packed away in a wooden crate destined for a museum storage room, its true significance completely missed. Today, researchers are going back through these century-old field notes line by line, looking for any passing mention of an object that, in light of our current knowledge, might be the missing piece of the puzzle. They might find a sketch of a shattered Ushabti figure, a rough drawing of a hieroglyph on a pottery shard, or a cryptic note about a piece of gilded plaster found in a corridor. These seemingly minor details, when entered into a modern digital database, can be instantly cross-referenced with objects sitting in museum collections in Cairo, London, or New York. A fragment in a Berlin museum's basement, labeled only "From the Valley of the Kings" circa 1913, can suddenly be identified as a missing piece of the unknown queen's funerary furniture when matched with a photograph from an old dig report. It's a global jigsaw puzzle with the pieces scattered across continents and the box lid lost to time. The museum basement itself has become a primary site of excavation. Institutions around the world hold millions of artifacts from early excavations, many of which have never been properly studied or published. Curators and researchers are now embarking on massive rediscovery projects, pulling out old storage crates and subjecting their contents to modern scientific analysis. That unlabeled alabaster jar fragment, under a portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer, it might reveal a chemical signature that matches the quarries used by Hatshepsut's artisans. A box of what was catalogued as linen wrappings might, upon careful unfolding, reveal a previously overlooked hieratic inscription, a prayer for the soul of the deceased, mentioning a royal name that was later erased. One of the most powerful new tools is reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. This technique involves taking dozens of high-resolution photographs of an object, each with light projected from a different angle. Specialized software then combines these images, allowing a researcher to digitally manipulate the lighting on the object's surface, effectively casting light from any conceivable angle. What appears to the naked eye to be a smooth, blank piece of stone can, under this virtual raking light, reveal the incredibly faint, ghostly impression of a cartouche that was smoothed away thousands of years ago. It's like being able to see the shadow of the erased name, a whisper from the past made visible through the magic of modern computation. This digital revolution extends far beyond analyzing single objects. Egyptologists are now building vast, interconnected databases that compile information from hundreds of excavations, thousands of monuments, and tens of thousands of artifacts. Imagine a researcher in California being able to query a digital library for every known object that bears the title God's Wife of Ammon from the mid-18th dynasty. In seconds, the database can return results from temple walls in Karnak, tombs in Thebes, and statues in the Cairo Museum, presenting them side by side for comparison. This allows for a kind of pattern recognition that was simply impossible before. A scholar might notice that a specific, rare spelling of a queen's name appears only on objects from a 10-year period, allowing them to precisely date a previously mysterious artifact. Or they might discover that the distinctive artistic style of a particular sculptor, the way they carved the curl of a hieroglyphic sign, appears on a statue fragment in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and also on the Defaced sarcophagus in KV60, creating a tangible link between the two. This isn't just about finding a name, it's about reconstructing an entire network of artistic workshops, administrative protocols, and political relationships. The digital database acts as a time machine, reassembling the scattered fragments of a historical moment and allowing us to see the broader context in which the unknown queen lived, ruled, and was ultimately condemned. The story of her erasure is no longer locked in a single tomb. It is encoded in 1 million data points, and we are finally learning how to read the code. Ultimately, the identity of this queen, whether she is definitively proven to be Hatshep, Sut, or remains slightly shrouded, is almost secondary to the profound truths her story forces us to confront. This is far more than an archaeological whodunit. It is a powerful, 3,000-year-old lesson on the brutal mechanics of power and the terrifying fragility of a legacy. In ancient Egypt, a civilization entirely obsessed with achieving immortality through stone and spell, we find the ultimate irony. That immortality was a privilege granted by those who came after, and it could be revoked with a hammer and a chisel. The campaign against her reveals a world where history was not a passive record but an active battleground, where the past was constantly being reshaped to serve the political and ideological needs of the present. Every empty cartouche is a fossilized act of fear, proving that even the most seemingly permanent and godlike rulers were vulnerable to the judgment of their successors. Her story pulls back the gilded curtain on the Egyptian monarchy, showing us the ruthless political calculus that operated behind the serene, idealized faces of the statues. It was a world where a woman's monumental success could be her greatest crime, and where the ultimate punishment was not death but deletion. This narrative also holds up a dark mirror to our own relationship with history. The ancient practice of damnatio memoriae feels unsettlingly familiar in our modern age of cancelled figures, rewritten textbooks, and digital archives that can be edited with a keystroke. The instinct to erase what we find threatening or inconvenient is not a relic of a distant past. It is a recurring human impulse. The Egyptians, with their profound belief in the magical power of a name, simply understood this on a metaphysical level. They knew that to control the past was to control the present and future. By trying to unmake this queen, they were attempting to dictate what stories could be told, what power could be remembered, and what models of leadership could be allowed to inspire future generations. Her empty tomb challenges us to question our own certainties about the past. How many other stories have been lost to similar acts of purposeful silencing? How much of history is merely the version that the winners felt comfortable preserving? Her ghost forces us to acknowledge that the historical record is not a pristine, objective truth, but a palimpsest, a document that has been written over, edited, and censored, with the faint, stubborn traces of the original story still bleeding through. Yet, the most inspiring part of this entire saga is the modern, painstaking quest to restore her voice. For every act of ancient violence aimed at silencing her, there is a corresponding modern act of devotion aimed at resurrecting her. This is not merely an academic exercise, it is a form of ethical and historical justice. It is a collective effort by epigraphers, archaeologists, geneticists, and historians to posthumously win a battle that she lost millennia ago. They are the counterforce to the ancient censors, using CT scanners instead of chisels and digital databases instead of plaster to meticulously reassemble our identity that was shattered. Each fragment of jewelry analyzed, each faded hieroglyph digitally enhanced, each strand of DNA sequenced is an act of defiance against that original sentence of oblivion. It is a statement that the truth has a tenacity that even the most determined efforts cannot completely extinguish. This work affirms that every person, no matter how successfully they were scrubbed from the official record, leaves behind a constellation of faint clues in their artifacts, in their DNA, in the very tool marks used to deface their monuments. We are learning to read the silence itself as a form of testimony. In the end, the unknown queen's greatest legacy may be the profound questions her story raises about memory, power, and resilience. She compels us to consider who gets to be remembered and why. She demonstrates that the drive to tell our stories and to have them heard is a fundamental human force, as powerful as the drive to silence others. Her empty sarcophagus and her rediscovered name together form a powerful symbol. They represent both the profound vulnerability of an individual's story to the whims of politics and the astonishing power of curiosity and persistence to reclaim it. She is a reminder that history is not just about the kings who built the most pyramids, but also about the voices that were almost lost and the relentless human spirit that refuses to let them stay silent. Her journey from a powerful ruler to a non-person and back to a subject of global fascination is in itself a triumphant narrative. It proves that while stone can be carved away and names can be chiseled out, the quest for truth is an unstoppable current, capable of wearing down even the most formidable walls of silence over time. And yet, for all our advanced technology and relentless detective work, we must confront a humbling and deeply compelling possibility. We may never attach a single, certain name to this queen. The final, definitive piece of evidence, a perfectly preserved, unequivocal inscription linking her directly to a known historical figure, might simply not exist, lost to the very efficiency of the ancient purge or still lying undiscovered beneath the sand. This state of permanent uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. In many ways, it is its very soul. The unresolved mystery is a powerful reminder that the past is not a jigsaw puzzle to be neatly completed, but a vast, fragmented mosaic where many of the tesserae are forever gone. We are left to infer the grand picture from the pieces that remain, and sometimes the most beautiful and profound stories are the ones that live in the spaces between the evidence. This enduring enigma forces us to engage with history not as a passive list of facts, but as an active, ongoing conversation, a dynamic process of interpretation where the questions can be just as illuminating as the answers. This inherent ambiguity is what transforms archaeology from a dry cataloging of objects into a deeply humanistic endeavor. It is a discipline built on a foundation of educated guesses, competing theories, and the thrilling possibility that a single new discovery could overturn decades of consensus. Think of it not as a science with set conclusions, but as the world's most complex and challenging cold case. A detective at a modern crime scene has access to witnesses, security footage, and DNA databases. An archaeologist, by contrast, is a detective who arrives millennia after the fact to a crime scene that has been looted, weathered, and deliberately tampered with. The witnesses are the silent artifacts, the motive is pieced together from propaganda carved by the victors, and the perp is often the one who left the most conspicuous absence. The true narrative is a ghost, and we chase it by reading the negative space, the empty cartouches, the reassigned statues, the curiously missing entries in temple records. The fact that we can build such rich, compelling, and logically sound theories about this queen's life and downfall from these scattered clues is a testament to the incredible deductive power of the field. The mystery persists not because scholars are unskilled, but because the ancient censors were, in their own way, tragically skilled at their jobs. This unresolved quest also highlights a crucial distinction between history and the past. The past is everything that actually happened in all its chaotic, sprawling detail. History, on the other hand, is the story we tell about the past, woven from the threads of evidence that have survived the relentless filter of time. The story of the unknown queen is a stark illustration of this filter in its most extreme form. A powerful faction actively manipulated history, attempting to sever the thread of her narrative completely. Our modern pursuit is an attempt to respin that thread, but we can never fully recover the original. We are, in a sense, telling a new story, one informed by evidence, but also by our own perspectives, our technologies, and our contemporary desire to recover lost voices. This doesn't make her story any less real or valuable. It simply means that her legacy is now a collaboration across thousands of years, a dialogue between her world and ours. Her silence in the historical record has, ironically, generated a torrent of scholarship, debate, and public fascination that has given her a kind of modern immortality, a second life in our collective imagination that her enemies could never have anticipated. Furthermore, the possibility of never knowing her name invites us to reflect on all the other voices that have been permanently silenced. For every powerful queen who was nearly erased, there were countless ordinary men, women, and children whose lives left no mark on stone or papyrus. They built the pyramids, farmed the fields, and raised the families that formed the backbone of this magnificent civilization, yet their stories are almost entirely lost to us. The unknown queen becomes a symbolic figure for this vast, anonymous multitude. Her mystery reminds us that history, as we know it, is overwhelmingly the history of the elite, the powerful, and the literate. The struggle to reclaim her identity is a proxy for a much larger, and perhaps even more poignant endeavor, the attempt to hear the faint echoes of everyone else. Her empty tomb is a monument not just to one woman's erased legacy, but to the inherent incompleteness of our connection to the ancient world. It keeps us humble, curious, and forever searching, knowing that for every answer we find, a dozen new questions will always emerge from the shadows of the past. So here we are at the end of our journey, a trail that began with a single, silent tomb and the violent emptiness where a queen's name should have been. We have walked through sun-scorched temples and descended into the cool darkness of the royal valley. We have watched as modern technology cast a new light on ancient stone, using CT scanners to read the secrets that chisels could not entirely erase. We followed the clues left in the dust of history, the artistic fingerprints on a quartzite sarcophagus, the royal DNA preserved for millennia, and the targeted fury of the hammer marks that betrayed a deep and personal fear of her memory. We explored the great theories, from the political vendetta of a stepson like Thutmose III against a formidable ruler like Hatshepsut, to the ideological cleansing after the Amarna heresy, and even the tragic possibilities of a scandalous affair or a lost succession war. Each thread we pulled unraveled a different facet of this extraordinary woman's story, revealing not just a victim of ancient politics, but a figure of such immense power that her very existence had to be denied for generations. The central, haunting question of her identity remains the pulse of this entire investigation, a mystery carved not just in the negative space of her monuments, but in the very nature of how history is made and unmade. The forces that sought to destroy her were, in their own brutal way, paying her the highest possible compliment. They were terrified not of what she did, but of what she represented, a legacy so potent it threatened to outlive their own. Now, this is where the case file passes from our hands into yours. After all the evidence, the high-tech forensics, and the scholarly debates, the final verdict is ultimately a matter of interpretation. Who do you think she was? Was she the great female pharaoh Hatshepsut, whose successful reign was too great an anomaly for her stepson to tolerate? Or was she a key player from the Amarna period, a queen like Nefertiti or Meritaten, whose name was tarnished by association with a failed religious revolution. Perhaps she was someone else entirely, a royal bride from a foreign land whose origins became a liability in a shifting geopolitical landscape. The evidence is laid out before you, a puzzle spanning 3,000 years. I want to hear your verdict. Head down to the comments and tell me which theory you find most compelling. Who is the ghost in tomb KV60 to you? This is what makes history a living, breathing conversation. It's not just about discovering the past, but about debating it, questioning it, and adding our own voices to the ongoing story. If unraveling mysteries like this one captivates you as much as it does me, then you are in the right place. Consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We are just getting started pulling back the veils on history's greatest enigmas, from lost cities to forgotten rulers, and I would love for you to join us on the next adventure. History, as we have seen, is rarely a simple story written in stone. More often, it is a narrative crafted by the victors, a version of events designed to consolidate power and legitimize a new regime. But as the story of our unknown queen so powerfully demonstrates, history is also rewritten by the persistent, by the archaeologists who spend decades in dusty archives, the scientists who peer inside stone with invisible light, and by all of us who refuse to let the silenced voices stay silent forever. Her legacy is no longer just in the objects she left behind, but in our collective determination to remember her. She is a testament to the idea that while truth can be buried, chiseled away, and plastered over, it has a stubborn habit of re-emerging, one careful discovery at a time.